When my mom announced we were moving into a new house, I didn't expect it to be a place so deeply rooted in the past. It was mid-2015 when we arrived at the property, and from the moment we pulled into the driveway, I could feel the weight of its history. The house stood tall, its weathered facade marked by the passage of time. The once bright paint had dulled to a muted gray, and vines had claimed parts of the outer walls as their own. It was built in the early 1900s, and that age seemed to seep into the very air around it. My mom, with her usual optimism, saw the potential. She spoke excitedly about renovations, tearing down walls, updating the old fixtures, making it ours. But despite her enthusiasm, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that crept into my chest as we crossed the threshold. The moment I stepped inside, it felt like the house noticed us. Like it had been waiting for someone to inhabit it again, for someone to walk across its creaky floors and disturb its long silence. At first, though, everything seemed fine. The first few weeks were marked by busy days spent unpacking, planning renovations, and getting used to the odd quirks of living in such an old home. Sure, the floorboards groaned underfoot, and the dim lighting cast long, eerie shadows in every room, but none of that was unexpected. After all, this was a house that had stood for over 100 years, and I had convinced myself that any unsettling feelings I had were simply the result of living in a place that looked straight out of a horror movie. I told myself it was just the house's appearance, the peeling wallpaper, the dust that seemed to settle no matter how much we cleaned, and the antique furniture that had clearly seen better days. At night, the wind would whistle through the old window frames, and sometimes I'd wake up thinking I heard whispers in the dark. But I shrugged it off. The rational part of me wanted to believe that my mind was just playing tricks. The house was just old, that was all. But then, there was the quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you'd expect in a country home. This silence felt heavy, oppressive even. It was the kind of quiet that settled into your bones, making every little noise seem louder than it should be. The faintest creak of the floor or the slightest rustle of wind against the windows would send my heart racing. And it was while I was alone, completely alone, that the quiet seemed to shift. I could feel it in the way the shadows grew longer, and how the house seemed to close in around me. The days my mom was out running errands, or when my siblings were gone, I'd catch myself listening too closely to the house. I'd stop mid-step, straining to hear something, anything, out of place. But it wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling that unnerved me most. It was as though the house had an invisible presence that lingered just outside my field of vision. A constant, subtle awareness of something watching, waiting. It didn't take long for that unease to morph into something darker. The house, which at first felt like an odd relic of the past, now began to feel more like a trap. Its age was no longer charming, it was unsettling. I started to wonder about the people who had lived there before us. Who were they? What had they experienced? And, more chillingly, why had the house been left empty for so long? One evening, while helping my mom organize some boxes in the attic, she shared an unsettling tidbit about the previous owner. The man had lived alone for years, and according to our neighbors, he had become a recluse in his final months. No one knew much about him, but there were rumors, whispers of strange noises at night, of visitors leaving the house feeling unnerved for reasons they couldn't explain. I asked my mom why the house had remained on the market for so long, given its historical charm. She shrugged, brushing it off as mere coincidence or perhaps the high cost of renovation. But the way she quickly changed the subject made me think she wasn't telling me everything. As the days went by, I noticed that the unease didn't just come and go, it built steadily. I wasn't the only one who felt it. My younger siblings seemed on edge too, though they couldn't quite explain why. My brother started avoiding the third floor entirely, saying it gave him bad vibes. My sister, normally fearless, would refuse to play upstairs unless someone was with her. And then, one night, I woke up to the sound of something. It wasn't the usual creaks of the house settling or the wind outside. This was different. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as I strained to listen, it became unmistakable, whispers. Low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to drift through the walls. I froze in my bed, trying to convince myself I was dreaming. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that it was real. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, filling the air with an unsettling energy. I wanted to call out to my mom, to wake her, but I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed by fear, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't until the whispers faded into silence that I finally managed to pull the covers over my head, trembling under the weight of the house's presence. I didn't tell anyone about that night. I didn't want to seem paranoid, and honestly, I wasn't sure what I'd heard. Maybe it was just the house settling, I told myself. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The house was changing, or perhaps we were starting to see it for what it really was. And the more time we spent there, the more it felt like the house was slowly unraveling itself before us, revealing secrets that were better left buried. By this point, I started avoiding being alone in the house whenever I could. I stuck close to my mom and siblings, but that didn't stop the sense of being watched. It was always there, lurking in the background. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if it was just the house or if something else entirely had taken notice of us. As the weeks passed, the unease grew, and I knew it was only a matter of time before things took a turn for the worse. We had walked into this house, thinking we could make it ours. But the house had other ideas, it wasn't done with us yet. And as much as I tried to ignore it, something dark had already begun to stir within those old, creaking walls. It was a cold afternoon in January 2017, just a few days before my birthday, when I found myself alone in the house. My mom had left to run some errands, picking up supplies for the party she was planning, and my brother and sister were spending the day at their grandmother's. For the first time in weeks, the house was completely silent, too silent. At first, the quiet was almost welcome. After all, being the oldest, I rarely had time to myself, and I figured I could use the stillness to relax a bit. But as the minutes dragged on, the emptiness of the house began to feel oppressive. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, each tick echoing in the vast quiet of the house. The light outside had dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor, and suddenly, the walls felt like they were closing in. The house always had this strange ability to make its presence known. When people were around, it felt less ominous, almost like the laughter and chatter of my family could drown out whatever ancient energy the house held. But alone, in that stillness, the house seemed to breathe. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the windows, felt deliberate, as if the house itself was alive, waiting, watching. I wandered around, trying to shake the feeling, but as I approached the stairs that led to the basement, a cold shiver ran down my spine. There, near the old wooden staircase, stood the glass door that separated the main house from the basement. It was one of those old, frosted doors, the kind that distorted whatever was behind it just enough to leave everything looking vague and unsettling. We never used the basement for much. It was damp, smelled of mildew, and had that strange, earthy odor like something was rotting far down below, where the light didn't reach. My mom kept the basement locked most of the time, only opening the door to toss down bags of recycling or old junk that was too broken to bother with. No one wanted to go down there. I certainly didn't. But as I passed by that day, something caught my eye through the frosted glass. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable, a shift, a slight movement. I stopped, staring at the door, my heart beginning to race for reasons I couldn't quite explain. There it was again. One of the recycling bags slid down the stairs. It didn't fall or tumble. It slid. Slowly, like something had pushed it, something just out of sight, hidden in the shadows at the bottom of the stairs. My breath hitched, and I stood there, frozen, trying to convince myself I hadn't really seen it. Maybe it was the draft? Or a trick of the light? But no, the air was still. Every instinct in me screamed to get away. I didn't want to know what had caused that bag to move. I didn't want to open the door and look into the cold, dark abyss that was our basement. Without thinking twice, I turned and bolted upstairs, my footsteps pounding against the wood. The hallway blurred past me as I fled to my room, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing in my chest. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at my bedroom door, half expecting to hear the soft shuffle of something or someone coming up the stairs after me. But nothing came. The house was eerily silent once again, and yet the quiet was almost worse than the noise. I strained to hear, but there was nothing, just the faint ticking of the old clock downstairs, marking each second in the otherwise still house. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that the old house was just settling, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that bag sliding down the stairs, of the cold dread that had crept up my spine the moment I saw it move. Time passed, but I couldn't bring myself to leave my room. My eyes kept darting to the door, half expecting it to creak open on its own. My mind was racing with possibilities. Had I really seen something? Was there someone or something in the basement? Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the familiar sound of my mom's car pulling into the driveway. Relief washed over me as the front door opened and her voice called out, breaking the eerie silence that had gripped the house. I practically flew downstairs, desperate to be around someone, to shake off the fear that had clung to me like a shadow. I didn't tell her what had happened, not yet. Part of me didn't want to worry her, and another part of me didn't want to admit that I had been scared. But deep down, I knew something was off about that house. It was more than just the creaks and groans of an old building. It was more than just my imagination. The house had secrets, and it wasn't done revealing them to us. That day was only the beginning of something far darker than I was prepared to face. From that moment on, I couldn't help but feel like the house was watching me, waiting for the next moment when I'd be alone again. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was in the basement wasn't just a draft or a trick of the light. Something had moved that bag, and whatever it wasn't finished with us yet.